Okay, we got a good case study on an O2 sensor slow response trouble code. This is a 2007 Hyundai Tiburon, and our trouble code is a P0133, which is a Bank 1 Sensor 1 O2 Slow Response. Quick shot of the code. What I've said in the past about these slow response trouble codes is most of the time you have a faulty O2 sensor. In this case, this sensor has been replaced 3 or 4 different times by the owner. Problem started after he installed an aftermarket exhaust system, and he ended up putting his factory system back on. There's some missing components for me. I'm not sure the order in which everything was done, but I know that this is at least on its 3rd sensor, and I believe that they are aftermarket components. So just something to think about as we continue going into this. Another thought for O2 slow response codes would be exhaust leaks. We don't hear any exhaust leaks on this car. If you get an exhaust leak near the oxygen sensor, it can pull oxygen in from outside and give you false lean conditions and can give you this slow response trouble code. So initially we don't hear any exhaust leaks and we have a slow response code. Let's look at the scan data next. Okay, looking at our scan data for our Bank 1 Sensor 1 and our Bank 2 Sensor 1, both upstream oxygen sensors. Ignore the up-down voltage signal we're looking at right now. This is a self-updating min-max scale, and we're only talking about a few millivolts difference there. Go ahead and start the car. Let's see what it looks like. These are heated oxygen sensors. They should heat up pretty fast and become active pretty fast. Go ahead and hold your RPM at like 2 grand. You see the difference right away between the Bank 2 Sensor 1 and the Bank 1 Sensor 1, how much more frequent the Bank 2 is. It does look a little bit choppy, but what we have to remember is this is processed data and we don't see the entire waveform at all points in time. The graph mode of a scan tool sort of plays connect the dots with the lines and fills in the gaps. Just let it idle. Most of the time we don't do detailed O2 sensor testing at idle, but I think on this particular car, you can even see the frequency difference even at idle speed. So we'll let that roll for about 30 more seconds and then we'll talk about it. Min-max voltage on the Bank 2 Sensor 1, 39 millivolts minimum and 961 on the max. Min-max on the Bank 1 Sensor 1, which is the one we have a trouble code for, is around the same, 49 min and 975 max. So the min-max scales look pretty good, but remember we also have to look at frequency when we're talking about O2s. It's not just amplitude. We need to worry about frequency, and clearly the frequency of this left side, this Bank 1 Sensor 1, left side of the scan tool here, the screen, is much less frequent than the right side. So I think the next thing that I want to do is let's pull up the downstream sensors on here too, and we'll look at all 4 of them together. And the only reason that I want to do that is I have seen at times that people will reverse plugs on oxygen sensors, especially if they're located right next to each other. I've seen vehicles that the connectors are right next to each other for upstreams and downstreams, and someone ends up reversing connectors and we end up having issues that way. Now I don't know where all these connectors are yet. I don't know if that's even possible here. but that would be why I want to look at all 4 of these now. Let's do that next. All right, this is all 4 of them. The bottom 2 is our upstreams, our bank 1 sensor 1 and our bank 2 sensor 1. Those are your upstream O2s, and the 2 top pictures would be your downstream O2s behind the cap. Typically what we'd want to see is this bank 2 side, this side right here. This looks good. A nice frequent O2 signal and a pretty steady downstream indicating the cat is functional. Not the greatest test in the world for a cat, but this is what all the theory would tell us as far as what a downstream sensor should look like. Would be a steady line, unfrequent. We don't want to see the same oscillations upstream and downstream. Interesting that the same side that we have a sluggish O2 on, this bank 1 sensor 1, we have a downstream signal that looks just like it. And that's suggesting that we have a cat problem here too on bank 1. So it looks to me like we potentially have 2 different problems. I'm not 100% sure yet, but I don't really like that one, for the reason that a downstream sensor shouldn't be switching at the same frequency that an upstream one is. So let's look at it again at a higher RPM, hold it at 2 grand. It doesn't have to be exactly 2 grand, just a higher RPM. Hold it steady if you can. All right, let it idle. Yeah, you can see that even at a higher RPM, our downstream, this is a cat monitor for bank 1. This one stayed just as frequent as the upstream. It looks like we got a bad cat on bank 1, but more importantly for what we're doing for this video right now is this bank 1 sensor 1 and how much less frequent it is than the bank 2 sensor 1. And if this vehicle did not have 4 different oxygen sensors put in it, I would be concerned right away about a faulty O2. I think we need to go a little bit further with this one. Now what the guy told me was that he used aftermarket O2s, and I don't like aftermarket O2 sensors in some of these cars. You can have issues. But what he did tell me, which is a very important piece of information, is this sensor, the other upstream, is also aftermarket. So both of these sensors are the same manufacturer. So I think we can rule out the fact that this isn't a factory sensor being the problem to start with, that he informed me that both of these upstream sensors are of the same manufacturer. So I think the next step for this is maybe some heater circuit tests to make sure our heater circuit's working. If the heater circuit isn't working, that can slow down the O2 signal. Although, a little quick thought on that, if it is a heater circuit fault, when we raise our RPM and hold it there for a while, exhaust gas should heat this thing up enough and make it very frequent. So let's do it one more time and really heat it up. Hold it at like 2500 and let's see if this bank 1 sensor 1 starts to look like the bank 2 sensor 1. If it does, that will indicate a heater circuit fault. If it doesn't, we're probably going to say it's not, but we're going to check it anyway. Go ahead, hold your RPM back up. on that, I'm saying it's probably not a heater circuit problem, but I think that's going to be where we're going to start. Now the important part here is going to be knowing which sensor is what on this car. So looking up firing order would be important so we know where bank 1 is. There's another way to do it too. If I can get to one of the upstream O2 sensors easily, I can unplug it and see what the scan tool reports. And actually I can do that. This upstream O2, I'll show you real quick. I'll go back to the scan tool. This upstream O2 connector is actually right there. So I'm going to unplug that connector while we're looking at the scan tool. And also what we found was that the number 1 cylinder is on the front bank. But just to show that method, in case you didn't have an information system, I'm going to unplug this upstream O2 right by the radiator. And we're going to look at our scan tool and see which one drops out on us. Okay, I just unplugged the one up front, and that's kind of interesting because our information said, unless we looked it up wrong, our information said that the number 1 cylinder was on the radiator side, but you can see the one that I just unplugged was actually the bank 2 sensor 1 on the scan tool. So I have actually seen issues at times where there's a discrepancy with scan data. And I like that test. That absolutely gives me confidence that my sensor I need to be focused on is not this one. It's going to be on the other cylinder head. So that's a pretty good test. I'm going to plug that back in. That was my bank 2 sensor one. So that means I got to work in the back side, which is unfortunate because that was a little bit more difficult to get to. But that's where we need to be working. So I'll do the same test back there next. Okay, I just unplugged the other upstream O2, which is this one. You see a nice steady line here now of around 400 millivolts. That is a bias line. Don't be too concerned about this bank 2 not switching anymore. I believe what I did by unplugging it is we set an open loop fault, and basically we're in a forced open loop condition now. Do a couple of snaps. We should see some reaction on this bank 2. That's good. And we saw that actually on all 3, even the downstreams, we're seeing reaction. And you saw that the bank 1 sensor 1 was not changing. And so basically with this test, guys, what we've done is we've confirmed that our wiring is correct on this and we don't have reversed wires. Now, I was concerned about that because all of the sensors were off and all of the exhaust was off. And did they plug them in right? And with this test, looking at this one on the scan tool, our bank 1 sensor 1, showing us that it is connected correctly. When I unplug it, it's dead. So we're happy with that. Neat little piece of information here. These are our trouble codes that we set by unplugging these O2 sensors. And the ones that are in here: sensor circuit malfunction, heater circuit high, sensor circuit malfunction, heater circuit high for both bank 1 and bank 2. And that's actually telling me that the computer's able to monitor these circuits pretty well. I like that. That's suggesting that the wiring harness and the heater circuit are okay. But the other thing that this will do is this will force an open loop condition. So if we go back to our scan data, we're not going to see the same type of reaction that we had just a few minutes ago. Hold your RPM up a little bit. And you see before we had a pretty nice looking bank 2 sensor 1. Well, what happened to that? Why is that not moving anymore? I believe what we've done is we've set an open loop fault here. See what this PID says. And you see our closed loop bank 1 is off and closed loop bank 2 is off. That's because we set those codes and it's no longer in closed loop. So it's kind of a pretty good idea of what loop status looks like, or what an oxygen sensor might look like when it's not in closed loop. Yeah, let it idle. And these numbers can be misleading because of the self-updating scale. It just did on the decel, it changed. But you see the unsteadiness of the bank 2 sensor 1. We'll focus on that one because that was the good sensor, and you see how it's pretty flatline on us now. Why? Because we are in open loop. Now there'd be two ways for me to get this back to closed loop. Would be to shut the car off and restart it, or clear the trouble codes. If I clear the codes, this should go back. If it doesn't, we'll have to clear the code, shut the car off, and restart it. Let's just see if it does it. Let's go back. We'll go data, codes. Sometimes it won't let you clear codes with the car running. We'll give it a shot. It says key on, engine off. So shut the car off, turn the key back on real quick so I don't lose my data. So really just cycling the key would have brought my closed loop control back. We really didn't need to clear the codes. Let's go back to our data. Go ahead and start the car back up. And what we should have now is closed loop fuel control again. And I didn't pull up fuel trim for this particular car because fuel trim to me is not really relevant to a slow O2. So I really don't care what the fuel trim numbers look like right now. Fuel trim is a factor here for sure, but it's not going to help me troubleshoot this slow response on this O2. I'll tell you right now that the fuel control and our fuel trim on this bank 1 side is not going to be as good as the bank 2. And even if it was, it doesn't matter. Fuel trim's not going to help me right now. Our concern then, definitely we have a catalyst issue here, but let's focus on this upstream. That's what we're doing here, slow response O2. We're going to focus here. And what we want to do is we want to check our heater circuit, and we want to check our signal and signal ground on the sensor before we would put a sensor in this car. And truthfully, this having multiple sensors put in, you know, there is a chance they were changing the wrong sensor. We don't know that. You can see our closed loop fuel control came right back. That's what closed loop would look like. You see an O2 that's moving back and forth like that. You are definitely in closed loop. You don't even need that data parameter to tell you that. So the next thing we're going to do is some scope tests on the sensor itself. And we know exactly which one, bank 1, firewall side. That's where we're going. Okay, I got my hand on the O2 connector. It's a 4-wire O2. Incidentally, I didn't mention this. This is a narrow band O2. This is not a wide band. It's a typical zirconia O2 heated. And you see the wire colors we have on the harness side. We have an orange, a white, a red, a blue. And I would need a wiring diagram to know what's what. But I cover this with you guys in my book. And we actually talked about this today, that when we know sensor side colors, we can actually shortcut this and not have to jump at a wiring diagram right away. And see if I can get a shot of this. We're looking at 2 black wires on the sensor side. And we're looking at a white and a blue. So right away we know that when we see 2 colors that are the same on a heated O2, that's the heater circuit. So the first text I'm going to do is on the 2 black wires. I should have a power and a ground. Now it might be a pulse width modulated design. I do not know yet. But to check the heater circuit, it's that simple. We're going to T-pin one of them and get our signal on the scope, and then we'll do the other one. So we'll do that first. Okay, major change of direction, guys. As I was inspecting the harness that I just showed you, and I was down in this area between the air intake hose and the brake reservoir. That was the connector I unplugged and our scan data showed the bank 1 sensor 1 drop out on us. And I said, because I physically unplugged the bank 1 sensor 1 and that the scan data showed me bank 1 sensor 1 voltage fix, I was comfortable that they didn't plug this in wrong. Well, as I looked closer at the harness, now that I'm really down in there, the one that I unplugged does not go to the upstream O2 sensor. Now think about this. I unplugged what I thought was the bank 1 sensor 1. Scan data showed me the bank 1 sensor 1 fix voltage on me. But the one I actually unplugged is the downstream sensor. And so what I now know is that these were plugged in wrong. Our suspicion from the beginning, because of everything that was done and 4 different oxygen sensor signals, or 4 different oxygen sensors that were put in this, our suspicions are confirmed that these were plugged in wrong. And so what we have on the bank 1 is a downstream sensor that's feeding into an upstream circuit, and an upstream sensor that's feeding into a downstream circuit. I'm going to switch these and we're going to take a look at our scan data, and then we'll talk about the befores and after a little bit more. Okay, I just want to be real clear on how we found this. This is a real basic thing. I physically unplugged what I thought was the upstream O2, and it was not. It was actually the downstream connector. On the scan tool, it showed me the upstream fix. That's how we caught it. So it was just a visual inspection was key on this diagnosis, and really knowing that we can use scan data and use it to identify sensor location. If you unplug a sensor on the scan tool, it better be that sensor that changes. That was how we caught it. So I'm going to see if I can get you a shot of these connectors. I'll try, and we're going to change them around. All right, so this connector right here, harness side connector, which is right below this air intake boot and brake reservoir, that is the upstream harness side connector. If you follow the sensor side harness, see if I can get you a shot of this zip tie that's down here. And this is somebody that had to route that harness. If you look at that metal line right there with that hex nut, right below that you got a black line, and that's coming up these brake lines, and there's your zip tie that somebody put on there. And I'm sure the reason they put a zip tie there is the harness was too long, or you know, didn't quite fit right, and they needed to keep it up away from the exhaust. So what I need to do is cut that harness, or cut that zip tie off, because that is going to the downstream sensor. And the downstream sensor connector, I'll show you where that's at. And this is on the passenger side of the vehicle, and you see another zip tie on this side, and this is the harness side right here of the downstream, and it goes to our O2 connector right here, and this is the upstream sensor connector, sensor side, that is connected to the downstream harness side. So this needs to be taken off, and we'll reverse the two, and I'll get you a shot of the scan data after. Okay, I got the O2 switched around on the bank 1 side of this engine. One of the things that I'm sure there's going to be some questions on would be the frequency of that O2, and I think maybe what we can think about is, remember, the downstream sensor was reporting into the upstream circuit. Think about what the computer's going to do. The computer's going to add fuel when the O2 goes lean, and it's going to take fuel away when the O2 goes rich. It being a downstream sensor, how much more fuel is the computer going to have to add and subtract before the O2 would respond? Because it's behind the cat. A lot more addition of fuel, a lot more subtraction of fuel. It probably would have been nice for us to look at fuel trim on this one, just to see that. We missed it. No big deal. Good chance this cat's ruined. Depends how long you drove it this way. As far as the upstream sensor and how it was reporting, it was very, very near what the downstream was. Remember, the upstream sensor physically was plugged into the downstream signal circuit. So our downstream scan data was actually reporting upstream sensor activity. And that one's more of a mirror of what the downstream, which was the upstream, was doing. So kind of crazy here. Downstream's upstream, upstream is downstream. That's what we had. Let's see what this looks like after. Go ahead, start it up. Again, self-updating min-max scales. Don't worry about all that initial activity. Again, hold your RPM up. We'll warm up this system a little bit quicker. Anytime you're looking at O2 sensors, if you can't hold the throttle steady, you're going to have issues of signal changing. I think right away we can see that our upstream is just as frequent now on both sides. That looks wonderful. Give me a couple of rapid snaps. All right, let it idle. Do it again, quick snap. Flutter the gas pedal. I'm trying to drive up these rear O2 signals so I can change that min-max scale. There we go. Do another one like that. Couple more quick snaps. The high RPM is not necessary here. More of the very rapid fluttering type. Good, I like that. You see we changed our min-maxes on our downstream sensors now. That'll give us a little bit better picture of what's going on. Some of that activity you were looking at there was just because the scales were so narrow. You see our min-max there is better. We got flat lines on our downstreams. We got nice oscillating signals on our upstreams. Again, our downstream sensors, that's what you want to see when the cat's functional. Now we can't make a final call on this upstream, or this is bank 1 sensor 2. So this is my downstream O2. This is my downstream, this is my cat monitor. We can't make a call on that cat yet just because that line is flat. One of the things about flat lines on O2 signals would be a flat line does not always mean that's a good cat. That's a poor test. I think really for now, the answer is going to be, because it's quitting time here, is clear the codes on this. This is one of our students' car. Let him drive it. We'll see how she does. But I'm comfortable with this fix. Reversed O2 wires. This car has been through a bunch of different places to have this done. 4 different oxygen sensors were put in this. Problem started after he dropped his exhaust, and they were not plugged in properly. That is a fix.